Good morning, all, and good morning, Dr. Prasanna. Welcome, everyone, to this session that we have on dysphagia and post-stroke dysphagia, more particularly. I'll just make a small introduction to Prasanna ji. He is quite well known. I'm sure many here already have interacted with him. He's the program director and clinical lead, Department of Onco-Neurology and Speech Language Pathology at HCG Hospital. He's also founding secretary of Society of Feeding and Swallowing Disorders, assistant professor at Nasima Institute of Speech and Hearing, associate editor in journal Speech and Swallow, an experience of about 10 years with an area of specialization of medical speech language pathology, dysphagia, neurology, innovation in healthcare. Written a lot of papers, has made more than 20 talks on dysphagia and associated disorders, head and neck cancers, voice rehabilitation. So I'm sure we'll have an interesting session going forward, and we'll be making best possible use of his experience and his presence here. This chat will be for about 30-40 minutes, the presentation, followed by question and answer. In the interim, please feel free to put in the chat box your queries as you have them. And of course, we will take them up as we go forward. And well, over to you, Dr. Prasanna. I will now keep quiet till the end of the presentation. And then, of course, I'll be asking you whatever queries I have. Yeah, over to you, Prasanna ji.
Sure. So thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm deeply honored to be with you all. So it is not, it is not really a honor or anything, but because it is my duty to make sure that I connect to, every stakeholder in this field, not just a medical practitioner. It should be to the society as well. I hope my presentation will throw some light on, some of the problems which may have been ignored, or probably, we may not even know to see whether it is a myth or a fact. Okay. So the topic is understanding post-stroke dysphagia, and I thank the Stroke Support India as well as Sonal ma'am for introducing me to the group, and it has been a wonderful experience for me to know what's happening on the ground. So we will just quickly look at what are the the swallowing functions. If at all you're not seen it, all the things, whatever is there in what I'm going to show is something which is already there. It's nothing new. I'm just going
at the start of a swallow, a food bolus is voluntarily pressed by the tongue up against the roof of the mouth and backwards towards the pharynx. In response to activation of pharyngeal pressure receptors, the swallowing center in the medulla initiates.
I hope audio is clear.
Yes, it is clear to me. I think it will be clear to everyone mostly. Yeah.
Great. So I'll continue to play.
Initiates reflexes that prevent food entry into respiratory passageways. The uvula contracts, which blocks the nasal passages from the pharynx. The laryngeal muscles contract, closing the glottis at the top of the trachea by tightly aligning the vocal folds. The epiglottis swings down upon the closed glottis. With all airways blocked off, respiration is temporarily inhibited. As the upper esophageal sphincter relaxes, pharyngeal contractions drive the bolus into the esophagus. The oral pharyngeal stage is done.
So we usually look at the dysphagia till the level of the food entering the esophagus, and we are improving our understanding of esophageal phase and how we could probably contribute to the normal functioning of esophagus. Now, till the time when the swallow gets affected, we may not even think about how intricate or how complex is swallowing function, because everything is normal. We may not even look at how many times we swallow in a day, whether swallowing of saliva is considered to be important, whether saliva is considered to be important, how much of quantity comes in somebody's mouth, in a day. All those things are important. Now, if you have carefully observed the video, there was another screen popped up into the video, which is video in a video, which shows that there are a lot of coordinated movements that are happening. It's not that one organ functions and the other organ is not functioning. It's a coordinated, synchronized movement. Now, these movements are important because it is a neurologically coordinated, muscular executed function. Okay. So if it was one organ responsible for everything, probably it would have been easier. But we have got a gift from God where one organ can function or do a lot of work for us in a great way. So I'm going to explain about what happened here generally. So this is a pre-oral stage. Now, why I keep playing these videos is because now everybody talks about choking or cough or aspiration is the things which is generally discussed in dysphagia. But what I would like to say is that if a person is not able to put the food in the mouth, that is also called as dysphagia or feeding problem. It is an umbrella term which covers anything to do with feeding or swallowing. All right. So if a person is not able to put anything in the mouth, then you cannot chew it nor swallow it. So that is something which is important. Now, food once goes into the mouth, it has to be chewed properly if it is solid. If it is liquid, or if you are drinking water, you should hold it properly. It is not like an open tube. You have to voluntarily swallow it. It cannot just happen like how the water flows through the tube. It is not that simple. It is a complex procedure which is generally automatic in us, until it is affected. So I'm going to go ahead and show you the difference between how a normal swallow and how an abnormal swallow looks. The first part of the video is the normal swallow, where it is showed trachea here, and this is the esophagus. This is where the food is supposed to go. The esophagus is generally closed and the trachea is open for breathing. Now, if you see here, some part goes into the food pipe and some part goes into the windpipe, some part of the food. So that is a problem for us. So whenever this happens, so usually we should be looking at safety issues and other things. This is not only the problem in terms of abnormal swallow. There are other problems as well. Now, if you look at this patient, the dentition is also affected. Probably this patient may be on, just the liquid diet, may not be able to chew anything. So this is about how to differentiate between normal and abnormal swallow. All right. So I'm going to give you perspective about how in stroke these problems can occur. Now, this is a video. I'm going to quickly go on the timeline which is mentioned there. So which is 20. You will be hearing some of the conversation as well. So this is the video fluoroscopy done on Zoom call where a referral physician wanted to see if we could get a good picture of the real-time picture of how the swallow was. So this is a patient who had lateral medullary stroke. Since 3 months, he was not able to have anything by mouth. There was a tube placed, which is a slightly bigger in size, which for 14 or 15, I think it looked like a 16 size, the nasogastric tube. If you see this video,
that is a good movement.
Just mute the video. Yeah. So if you see the video again, you see a lot of pooling of the contrast which we used to do the study is there. Now you see a lot of pooling here in the pharyngeal area. However, the food is not entering the airway, which is okay for us, which is a reassuring thing for us that he's not coughing. There are a lot of movements happening, up and down movement happen. Some things open, some things close. All those are important, which needs to be happening coordinated. So this patient usually had a problem of drinking water. If it is thinner consistency, if it is water or let's say milk, these consistencies he had major problem. But if it was a biscuit dipped in milk, he was much comfortable. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and show another video. So this is post-COVID encephalopathy, which is kind of stroke as well. It's related to brain problem, brain injury, because of the complications which may happen after COVID or during COVID. So if you see in this patient, this is a young patient, who had COVID and then had this complication. The problem with this patient was the patient was not able to hear anything. There was a hearing loss as well. Whatever instruction you give, the patient was not able to do it. So, but if you hand a cup of liquid to the patient would generally drink it with some kind of efficiency. Now, if you see, is generally the liquid should go to the pharynx when the larynx closes. So it may be a little complex for you, but it should not have like a waterfall effect. Waterfall means before the liquid enters the areas where it has to be swallowed, the airway should be closing. The breathing should stop when we are swallowing. If it doesn't stop, then there is high chance that the patient will cough. Okay, this is one domain of the spectrum in neurological condition where dysphagia can be seen. There's another video. Again, this is in cerebellar stroke, where the patient had an issue with opening of esophagus. Okay. You see this, there's not much of opening which is happening at the level of esophagus. That's why the food is being obstructed at the level of pharynx, and at the level of throat. That's why it is going towards the airway. So there are different problems. Now, clinically, I can list down at least 50 problems, 50 different kinds of problems, but sometimes it comes out to be just cough, for somebody who is complaining about dysphagia. So those are the spectrum of dysphagia which can be presented clinically. So we'll go to what are the myths and facts about these patients or the problems what we encounter every day. So like I said, myths and facts are dependent on lack of knowledge. It could be ignorance. Somebody may have the knowledge, but if they fail to recognize it, or if they are not willing to collaborate with other departments in the hospital, or any other reasons, probably it will also cause problems. And some people say that, okay, that person or the old patient who suffered before, didn't have this problem or had this problem, he did ABC treatment, he became all right. I think I also should follow whatever that patient has undergone. That may not be true, because you never know, if a patient A and patient B is same. He may have the same kind of scan, same kind of MRI reports, which says that exact location or exact size of the stroke, but the symptoms may differ, or the kind of response a patient gives to the treatment may differ. So we should not compare ourselves to others, how they have recovered or how they have worsened. And we also have a famous doctor, which is Dr. Google, which generally we do it. Of course, you have to rely on some of the information, because you may not be readily going to a hospital, or doctors may not be accessible for you whenever you need it. But you have to look at the information which is provided in Google, with a mindful decision making about what is authentic and what you should be avoiding. Okay, so this is always has a fight with these things, with science and evidence. Now, why I separated science and evidence is because science may say certain things, but in experience, the anecdotal experience in clinics may sometimes disprove science and say that, okay, there can be something more than science. That is where evidence-based practice comes, and how science needs to be improved or updated is something which you need to look at. So what are the famous myths or facts? It can be like any other disease or disorders, or even stroke. Stroke itself has a lot of myths. There are some myths here which I'm going to read out, that strokes only happen in elderly, which is not correct. Now we have seen, a 9-year-old child having stroke. So those are all possibilities. Strokes are rare. No, it is not rare. There are good number of patients who are suffering with strokes, and the worst part is that after stroke, the life becomes stagnant sometime. Medically or clinically, there may not be any symptoms. Stroke is that one-time problem one-time problem, it is treated, and then after effects remain throughout the life sometimes. So that's why there is need of rehabilitation for these patients. And other things, a stroke takes place in the heart, which is not always true. There are other strokes which happens like, heat strokes or cold stroke, and there are different areas wherever there is blood supply. And if it is cut, that is called a stroke. It could happen in the brain as well. Strokes aren't preventable. That is again not true. Strokes can't be treated. Again, there are different conditions apply for the stroke treatment. You cannot have stroke today and come after 6 months for treatment. And you may not respond in the same way how you would go in the window period of 4 hours. All right. And the most common signs of stroke is pain, which is not true. Strokes aren't hereditary. Again, not true. If strokes symptoms pass, you don't need to treat the patient. That is again not true. There are scenarios where patient directly came to me after having a stroke, where they had a difficulty in identifying the time, disorientation, not able to swallow, not able to sit on a chair. And then when we examined her, there was a probable stroke as a cause for all the symptoms. We had to send them to the hospital first and then see it. That also can happen. All right. And other things are smoking doesn't affect. Yes, smoking is one of the cause. And stroke recovery only happens in the first few months after a stroke, which is not true, completely true. But if it is treated earlier, then the recovery becomes better. So these are all the things probably it is spoken over and over again in stroke support groups and other awareness programs. I'm going to quickly go on to the dysphagia as such. All right. So I'm going to give my perspective on what are the statements which is made. Okay. So there is a statement that sometimes a cough is just a cough, which is not true. Not entirely true. Cough may tell a lot of things, and then cough may not be overrated or underrated as well. You need to examine and then see if it's really bothering a person. All right. So these are the 3 statements. That is, if you don't cough, you aren't aspirating. Aspirating here means the food going into the trachea. This is not true. You need to clearly see what are the clinical signs of cough and what are the possible signs which the patient is showing it to. Right? Even at home, if the patient is having food and not coughing, as a clinician, I'm worried, because not having cough is just a problem for me. If a person is coughing, at least I know that the patient is able to manage whenever there is aspiration. All right. The second statement is, if you cough, you are aspirating. May not be true. So aspiration is only when food enters into the trachea, not trying to enter. Okay, trying to enter is a good sign for us to see whether the patient is able to manage it or not. Okay, and the last one is, if you cough, you're choking. Choking means somebody's putting pressure on your neck. That can be a feeling explained by a patient or breathlessness, but cough may not directly relate to choking. It could be other problems as well. If a patient is having breathing issues prior to eating, anything which is done probably have choking feeling. Okay, so breathlessness can be felt as a choking feeling. So there are other myths, that is about thickened liquids. Like I always say, myth, if you want to understand it, first you need to make sure that you have knowledge about all the things in the field. I'm not sure how many people know about the use of thickened liquids in dysphagia. In abroad, at least in the US or European settings, thickened liquids are the ones which generally are used as one of the treatment modalities for dysphagia. So there are myths about it. That is, thickened liquids are safer than thin. When I say thickened liquids, it could be like Dalia or Ganji, which we generally say it is thick in viscosity or consistency. May not always happen that thick liquids are safe. Sometimes the patient is able to have the water or milk properly, but may not be able to have thick liquids. All right. Similarly, thickened liquids must be recommended along with modified solid. May not be always true. If a person is on thickened liquids, they can never have water. Something we need to look at as a clinical sign. Not possible. Sometimes it becomes difficult to use thickener to give water. That means, let's say, if a patient is having problem in having water, usual suggestion is that let's thicken the water and see if the patient is able to have. Okay. As soon as I thicken it, you can have starch to use, to be used with water to thicken the consistency, but the amount of hydration a patient would get becomes less and less. Okay. So water is water by the end of the day. You need at least 3 liters of water to be consumed to have well hydration, for your daily functioning. Okay. It is also important for hemodynamics and other functions of the body. Okay. You cannot always have thickened liquids. Also, you cannot always have liquids when you're still coughing. Modified solids. People without teeth can't eat regular texture diet, which is again not true. Why I say this? Because I recently promoted myself as a father, and I know that a 6-month-old baby can eat mashable, mechanically soft diet. Initially I didn't agree with my wife, and the moment my wife gave a full card to my daughter, and when I saw my daughter eating it without having any problem, that's when I realized that teeth are not always required to eat solid foods. Of course, it is required to chew, but if it is mechanically soft, you can always use it. All right. And there are other misconceptions about using ice creams and jello. Whenever a clinician says that you can have soft diet or soft solids, some people think that ice creams or jello, which is usually in jelly form, is also soft solids. That is not true, because as soon as you put ice cream into the mouth, it melts and it becomes liquid. So that is not considered as soft diets. Please do not try all these things at home when you are on modified diet. If a person can have thin liquids and soft solid, they are good to have mixed soup. That means you are giving one consistency at a time. Okay. Mixed soup is kind of a consistency is like a pulpy orange or pulpy juice. That means you have liquid as well as you have solid with it. So you need great control to have all this mixed diet. Unless you are able to handle those things in small quantity, you cannot have it by your own. Okay. So you cannot take decision on your own. Make sure that you are safe to have all the consistencies which is generally available in the daily use settings. Okay. And also cooked rice and corn are part of dysphagia diet, which is soft, which is again not true. If it looks or feels to be soft, that doesn't mean that it is soft diet. You need to know how many times you need to chew it to make a bolus. When cooked rice is there, you need to really chew and make it into a bolus. Otherwise, the grains remain and then you may have problem in swallowing. Even one grain can cause cough. As soon as the cough comes, the other problem starts. It becomes like a cyclic process. Okay. Even though you may not have that much problem in the other consistencies, that cough can generalize itself to other scenarios as well. And then you start to think that, oh, I cannot swallow anything. And the doctors or the clinicians start to feel that, okay, this patient cannot have anything. All that the problem is created by 1 grain of rice. Okay. So you need to be careful in choosing what to be taken. Swallowing strategies, myths about that people with dysphagia shouldn't use straws, which is again not true. There are techniques or the clinician report which shows that straw may be a little safer than using cups. Again, you need to look at what are the symptoms clinically and what is comfortable for you or what consistencies are you using. Tucking your chin down makes you swallow safer. That means, if you bend down and swallow, may not always make swallowing safer. There are clinical conditions where these techniques are used, but you cannot choose these techniques on your own. Okay. And these are all because these informations are available in Google. Okay? You can easily find all these terminologies available in Google. Other things are smaller bites are always safer than bigger ones. May not be true. If somebody has sensory problems or they're not able to feel the food inside the mouth, if you have only small bite, they may not be able to even swallow. Okay, that may remain in the mouth and then later on it may create problems. Sometimes you have to use bigger bolus. Other things are if a person is eating or drinking during speech therapy session, they are good to have full meal, which is not true. You have to make sure that in different context, at home and in a restaurant with someone else, whether you are able to have your favorite snacks or not. Okay, clinical setup is a controlled setup. We all know, we are confident that if at all there is an emergency, we'll be able to handle it. But home environment doesn't happen like that. You're always anxious that what may happen if there is an emergency. Okay, so those things are also important. The recommendation of the SLP for a specified diet are forever, which is again not true. When we say, when as a speech pathologist tell instruction to the patient, we want to make sure that we are progressing forward, and we want to make sure that whatever we are doing is safe and nutritive to the patient. If I'm just working on safe swallow but not looking at nutrition of the patient, I'm not doing good enough for the patient. Okay, you have to look at both the things. And if someone aspirates during an instrumental swallow, that is, the videos which I showed, you must have seen that the food is entering the airway. That doesn't mean that in all the situation the patient has problem. I need to make sure that I establish that fact that it is not safe to give different consistencies. Then only I make my recommendation. Otherwise, just because I saw aspiration or a problem in one instance, I'm saying that, okay, the patient cannot have anything at all. That is wrong. Okay. Again, we have to make mindful decisions. How does a patient help in this? You can always ask, whether these aspirations or problem can come in the home situation, what we should be doing if at all there is any situation like that. So when you become aware of it, you will be able to take on those adventures of swallowing even when there is problem. Okay, so those things are also important. About oral care for dysphagia, there are myths that people without teeth don't need to clean their mouths, which is wrong. The problem, or the hygiene may not be just on the teeth. It is gums, tongue, or even at the palate, which you need to keep it clean. Swabbing the mouth with an oral care sponge is just as good as toothbrush. No, that is also not true. The best way to keep the mouth clean is by toothbrush and paste. And the last one is poor oral hygiene is one of the main reasons for pneumonia. This is not a myth. This is a fact. If you don't have any aspiration, let's say you are able to eat everything very well, but your oral hygiene is bad, you may get pneumonia, and you go to the hospital, and the patient, the doctor, the treating doctor sees your X-ray and says that, okay, you have pneumonia, probably because you have swallowing problem. And then they are going to put the tube, and then you will not be able to swallow anything. So, you have problem somewhere else, and you are treating something else. So this is not a clinician's fault, or this is not a patient's fault. This is just that we are not able to recognize what is the root cause of the problem. If you would have done a good oral hygiene program, probably this situation of putting an NG tube may not arise at all. Okay. And myths about feeding tubes. If you opt to have feeding tube, you will never eat again, which is not true. Feeding tubes are temporary to make sure that nutrition is going. I cannot say that 1 week I'm not going to give you anything until I improve your swallowing functions. No, I cannot have that. I have to make sure that I make a decision. If I'm able to improve swallowing within a short period of 1 day or 2 days, then I'm okay to not put tube. But if it is going to take weeks together to improve swallowing, I need an alternate feeding method. Otherwise, there will be malnutrition. And again, patient becomes weak. Patient will not be able to do anything. So this is an awareness thing for patient as well. Patient also has to take a decision on whether they are really able to take or not. Sometimes patient themselves doesn't opt for feeding tube. They keep rejecting, saying that I don't need tube. I will struggle and eat, no problem. That may not be helping us in the healthcare setup. Okay. And if you have a tube, that's not necessary that you'll not be able to eat by mouth. As a speech pathologist, we would make sure that whatever possible, we would through mouth, and overall nutrition is given through the tube. All right. People with feeding tubes can't aspirate because they aren't eating. That's also not true, because you can aspirate your own saliva. And if you keep aspirating on saliva and it is not treated, then that itself can cause breathing problem and pneumonia. So we need to be careful about that as well. And people with track tubes with an inflated cough can't aspirate. Again, this is in scenarios where patients would require tracheostomy tube for alternate breathing because they are not able to handle their secretions, or they're not in their good sensorium to manage on their own, or they are not able to come out of oxygen support post surgery. In those cases, there is a cuff which can be used during swallowing. So when we use it, we may not completely give good hyolaryngeal excursion, that is complete normal physiology. We are just avoiding whatever going down the trachea. So which does not mean that we are having safe swallow. As soon as you take out the air from the cuff, I'm sure everybody understands the cuff. It is a balloon which controls the secretions from going down into the trachea. Okay. So if you can use it, you can feed and make sure that you take out all the food items which is collecting there. If you don't take it out, it is going to trickle down and create problem later on. Okay. So these are about tubes. Now signs and symptoms. A runny nose while eating is a sure sign of aspiration. May not always be true. The patient may be eating spicy, or they may have sensory stimulation which is happening, which can show that runny nose is there. If a person has diminished gag reflex, again, it is not a sign of swallowing disorder. And there are studies which says that 50% of the population, normal population, does not show gag reflex. All right. And the next thing about signs and symptoms is that if you identify a problem in swallowing on a test, doesn't mean that you are passed or failed. It is just an understanding for a clinician what to do for the swallowing problem. It is never pass or fail criteria. And if the swallowing test shows that there is no problem in swallowing, that doesn't mean that there is no problem in swallowing. We have to make sure that in different scenarios, in different tests, we have to identify whether there is problem or not. All right. So why we are stressing on all these things is because more and more decisions are being taken at the level of patients when they go back home, or because somebody is telling that, oh, no problem, you can take whatever you want. The test may be just at that moment, or probably you may not even see the doctors when you have cough because somebody has said that the cough is normal. So we're just trying to make sure that you make an informed decision on what you want to do or how you want to go ahead in the, whenever this problem happens. All right. So other myths about signs and symptoms are an instrumental study is done solely to determine person aspirating, which is not true. So you may ask a doctor, I am not coughing. Why do you still want to do a, testing on me? Like I said, aspiration or food entering the trachea is not the only sign of swallowing problem. It could be chewing. It could be pushing the food down to the esophagus. It could be pharyngeal residue, or having food getting stuck in the throat. All those are problems. We need to identify it and only treat it. All of that have problem of aspiration if it is not treated. All right. And the next myth is a good SLP or good speech pathologist can tell exactly what's happening through a bedside exam and does not need any other instrumental evaluation. So if you say so, then probably you are not doing anything good to the patient. We may have some understanding in bedside examination. When I say bedside examination, just by giving the food, I may not have that vision of X-ray to see where exactly the food is going. I may rely on the patient's cough or no cough and make my decision. But in cases where the patient does not cough, but still the food is entering the windpipe, I will not be able to see it unless I do a instrumental evaluation. That is X-ray vision of swallowing. All right. And about treatment of dysphagia, I already told, I heard, they told, or I was not told. These are some of the things which we generally hear in the OPD. Again, you have to authenticate or validate those things. You cannot rely on hearsay. You have to make sure that you get a clearance from a physician or a speech pathologist about your swallowing problem and progression into different consistencies. And we always look at Dr. Time as a healer for our problems, which is again not true. If you give time, time is going to let the body heal by itself. Body may not heal how you want it. You have to make sure that you have to guide the body to heal by itself. All right. So you have to do exercises or take medications to make sure that body is going in the right direction for healing. Right. Massage, again, patients keep asking, can we have massage to improve swallowing, the neck massage or the cheek massage? In some cases where the sensory issues or the lymphedema or the problem is there, we can probably use massage, but massage is not a sole cure for the problem. Ayurveda, again, there are a lot of questions about whether we can have Ayurvedic treatment, whether we can have medicines for dysphagia, which is again questionable thing because I've not come across any treatments which cure or which improve dysphagia. There can be medicines used for edema or reduction of saliva, but swallowing function has to be improved only by practice and exercises. Right? Some of the surgeries can be performed, in very severe cases where the speech therapy or swallowing therapy does not help, but those are all rare conditions where we need to take an informed decision, in a interdisciplinary approach. Everybody should give their opinion about whether this problem can be treated or not. And this also needs to be informed to the patient. Patient knows what they are going through, and patient will know whether they really did the effort during the swallowing therapy or not. Okay, surgery may be an answer, but once you do the surgery, you cannot reverse it. So that's why we keep saying that practice on your own and see if you can improve. And again, rehabilitation, there is always a debate about who actually handles swallow therapy. There are physiotherapists, occupational therapists practicing these things. Of course, they all come with knowledge, but the skills developed in the swallow therapy profession, where we generally deal with swallowing as a separate domain, and we train ourselves or skill ourselves based on our knowledge as well as our training. Okay, so every patient or every family who have a patient who has stroke needs to make an informed decision about where to go, where to approach, whom to approach, and what needs to be done. All these things are important because at the end, the stakeholders who are going to be affected by improvement or no improvement is the patient. So with this, probably I can take some of the questions and then see if I can address those things and give safe and efficient swallow suggestions. Probably we can discuss based on the questions which may come in.
Right, yes, indeed. Thank you very much, sir. I think there's a lot there that you put across, and certainly we can open it to questions if anyone has. I have some, maybe it will sound very elementary to you, Dr. Prasanna, but I'm just trying to put myself, into similar situations. I have a layman, let's say, I'm a layman. I have a patient maybe suffering from dysphagia, probably suffering from dysphagia. How do I firstly identify that there is aspiration at home? Now I'm at home. I'm not a specialist. How do I find out that there is a problem? I mean, if he's coughing, may not be an aspiration. If he is not coughing, maybe aspiration. So given those situations, how do I find out there's a problem to begin with?
Okay. So usually, first thing we need to look at is whether we understand what is the clinical problem with the patient. Now, usually there are different disorders which would cause dysphagia or problems in swallowing. Now, there are problems like stroke, there could be traumatic brain injury, and specific to stroke, if they have earlier had a stroke and had tracheostomy tube placed or tube was there or the feeding tube was there for prolonged duration, probably they are at the risk of having these problems. Now, you would definitely know that, they have gone through all this treatment. You already know in the back of mind that he had a history of stroke. Okay, that is one point. And the second point is that during the meal time, if the patient is showing some of the signs like, consistently coughing every time the patient tries to eat something, or, the watery eyes are there every time, though the food is not spicy, or, the patient is showing, aversion towards some of the food, consistencies, whatever you're giving. In those situations, if it is consistent, probably you need to look at consulting a physician or consulting a speech pathologist to see whether this is really bothering or not. Now, there are other signs that the patient could have breathing issues if it is long-standing and if you not recognize it for a couple of days. So these are the things which you could look at. If it is consistently there for at least half day, then you should be able to suspect that there could be swallowing problem, or the patient may start to have aspiration. Cough may not directly mean that there is aspiration, but at least it should say that as early as possible, get it diagnosed to see whether we have to prescribe cough syrup or dysphagia therapy.
Okay, so as I hear, if there is a consistent issue, let's say over a period of half a day, then probably there is something which requires more investigation. Then what is the next step? We go to a hospital, or we call a speech language pathologist. Can he do that kind of assessment in a home setting? What next?
So ideally, you would generally go back to your treating physician. If it is a neurologist, you would go back to them and then you express this complaints that he's been having cough. If there is already a speech pathologist or dysphagia specialist working with the patient prior, and then probably he's got discharged, there was no problem for some time, then based on that you try and connect with the individual person. So what I've usually seen is that they would generally go to the primary physician, who's a neurologist, and then get referred to a speech pathologist to see if at all there's something to worry based on the assessment to be done. So it could be at home, preliminary assessment can be done. Now in COVID scenarios, you would do a video call and see if it really, bothering the clinical status of the patient, whether we need to pay attention to what has been happening, whether you need to be visiting the speech pathologist or a hospital set up to have further evaluation done.
Okay, but it can be, it's not an emergency situation at that time that one needs to rush to a hospital.
It is kind of an emergency situation because if we find out that there is no problem, it is still okay. But if there was problem and you delayed it, probably the complications which is surrounding to it is higher. So it's not just on a physical complication, it is also on a psychological front. Now the patient may have aversion, or he may be at risk of aversion towards food or the medical care itself. Or there are situations where there is aversion towards the family member who's taking care. There are scenarios where the patient started to not cooperate with the family member who did not recognize that the patient was coughing, or the family member said that, no, this is not a problem. It has been happening and it will keep happening. So they kept on feeding, even though there was, consistent cough. When they came to OPD and then we suggested that, no, this is a serious problem. We have to put tube and they have to go on a treatment, swallowing treatment. That is when patient turned to the primary caretaker and said that I don't want you to touch me at all. So these are all the things which is surrounding that, which is finding an opportunity to come in. So I would rather say that you would go and get it tested. And if it comes negative, that is no problem, it is a good thing for us. But if you find some problem, it is still good thing because we have found it very early.
Correct. And as we can say, then the dynamics can change. The person can lose confidence in the family caregiver, which then leads to further problems down the line. Correct. If anyone else has any questions at this stage, maybe you can unmute or raise your hand, or you can put in the chat box and we can come to you. I think Shruti ji has raised her hand. I'll unmute her. Yeah, go ahead, Shruti ji. Shruti ji, you can speak up.
Hello, Prasanna sir, Bangalore. Hello, sir, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yes,
Yes, you are. You can speak up.
So what I want to know is dysphagia any symptom of stroke? I read it in a myth somewhere, long time ago that some coughing presided with dysphagia is a symptom of stroke, but many people overlook it. Is it really true?
Coughing and dysphagia itself becomes a problem, whether it may be due to anything else or stroke or anything. Now, usually, there's not always a situation where you are eating and you have a stroke. So it may not always happen. And the probability of having stroke while eating is very minimal. It can happen anytime during the day. Now, since it can happen anytime during the day, cough or dysphagia cannot be considered as a sign of stroke. But cough and dysphagia itself is a sign of some problem which needs to be addressed at the earliest. Now, in the way we find out that there is a stroke, then probably that's a bonus for the medical care for of the patient. But
thank you, sir. I have one more question.
Not a primary symptoms of stroke.
Okay. Yes. Thank you, sir. I have one more question. Sir, a person who is tube feeding, a person with aphasia, I want to know, is the progress difficult for such a person, or is the speech language training difficult for a person who is tube feeding or who has tracheostomy?
If you are looking at co-occurring conditions, that is aphasia, swallowing problem, and tracheostomy, all the three things. If the patient is able to speak with tracheostomy tube, then it doesn't make much difference. But if there is swallowing problem and the patient had the need of tracheostomy, that means it is considered that as a bigger problem or bigger infarct than the usual, where the patient would come out of the tube, but at the end of the discharge, probably they just have aphasia. So this is a co-occurring conditions. It will only make things complicated, but prognosis individually may not have that kind of effect. If you look at problem for swallowing therapy, now if the patient is not able to understand the instructions, probably then you can look at a slow progress. But there are ways to bypass the language issues or the understanding issues by making it integral part of activities of daily living. You can still do it. I don't see any challenge in those areas. But definitely, yes, it is a complex procedure, but yeah, you can still have the same kind of prognosis in such patients.
Yes, but obviously it adds to the difficulties, the challenges I can imagine. And we did have a situation some time ago. So I think we were talking in our group also. Someone had swallowing issues, which later resolved or were found to be a consequence of a stroke. So as you said, at least establishing the underlying cause can lead, to treating it later. The other thing that came to my mind, you were talking about hydration. Hydration is essential, 3 liters. At the same time, you're talking of the patient needs thickened liquids at that time. He cannot handle the total like watery liquids. So how do you kind of arrive at a balance? What do you do then? You want to have hydration, but you cannot give water.
Usually we look at hydration with the tube. So initially, and then there are scenarios where the patient was not able to have water. That's why we kept NG tube, that is tube through the nose. And then we have to quickly work on swallowing and correcting all those physiological problems which is there for swallowing functions. let's say I'll give you two scenarios. Now, a patient has problem in swallowing water versus a patient has problem in having idli or dosa. So for whom I would, aggressively treat is the first patient. Okay. Why?
Okay.
Because if the patient is not able to have dosa or idli, it is only about his likings, about different kinds of food, variety of food in his daily, daily meal time. But in the first patient, the hydration and nutrition becomes question, because if the patient has problem in water, then he may also have problem with liquids. We cannot go on giving just the solids. Liquids are more important for the body than the solids. Of course, nutrition becomes, delivery of nutrition becomes simpler and easier with solids, but liquids are also important. So I think we would look at giving the alternate feeding method for liquids and quickly work on the safe swallow strategies for a patient who has problem in swallowing water. But as a temporary strategy, we would also look at starting with thickened water or thickened liquids, the agents which can thicken the water, and then slowly progress down to the regular consistency of water. So we would compensate and move towards having normal swallowing.
Right. Okay.
It's a tricky question, sir. I probably
it's a balance that I think one has to make at all times. I can understand.
Sometimes it may look like I'm beating around the bush, but that is the limitation of the swallowing problems, and it is not one-day job. We have to respect, just like how Sachin Tendulkar would respect a good ball and he'll leave it. Just like that, we will also have to respect the problem and make sure that we improve upon it over a period of time.
True. But in your experience, how long? I mean, of course, I know that it varies from individual to individual, but how long? I'm sure this is a normal question that you must be facing all the time. How long is a person, so if he has gone on to into a tube feeding, and of course, as you said, genuine concerns, at least we have as lay people, swallowing bhi bhul jayega, itni der padi rahegi to, as you rightly pointed out yourself. So how long is the normal duration where, the tube remains in and you don't start getting concerned about it as a doctor or as a layman that now it is too long?
Okay. So for a dysphagia specialist, I think, it again depends on the medical condition. I would safely say, if the tube is there longer than a week's time, then I'm worried. I'm worried that why there is no referral for me, or why, patient is not coming to speech and swallow department, or why we are not looking at assessing what exactly the problem. But again, if it is related to the medical condition per se, which mandates that we have to keep the alternate feeding for longer duration, I would still agree with it. But a safe number of days would be 7 days for me.
So if it is in for 7 days, it's time to certainly have a referral, to certainly investigate it more with a specialist as to what's going on and going forward and plan that better.
That's right, sir.
And anyone else, please feel free with your questions. If anyone has any thoughts, you can put in the chat box. Of course, the other issue that we face as laymen, and again, this has been coming on the group also off and on, how do we find an SL, speech language pathologist to begin with? I'm in Visakhapatnam, I'm in Ranchi, for example. How do I find, is there a central place that I can go to? Of course, I can Google and all that, but is there a repository which can tell me that these are the SLPs or the swallowing specialists available in that region?
So that's a very good question. I'm going to take that question, and I think I'm going to discuss this question with my team members as well. but I don't think I can completely answer that question, because whatever I'm telling right now may not satisfy, because you're looking at a positive answer. But what I would say is that there are a list of people who are practicing speech language pathology, but we do not know who's practicing what and with what capabilities or what competence. That information is lacking, in any public forum. We don't know what is happening, but our efforts is going to be towards that, because we have formed a new society for feeding and swallowing disorders. I think I'd be more than happy to connect with Stroke Support India as well, because connecting to the layman is very important for a society to reach out to the public. We have planned on again like a directory thing, not just listing on the geographical locations of a person who's practicing, but also on competence mapping. So let's say there are speech pathologists working in one area. One may be specialized in only neurological cases. Another person may be only expertise in pediatrics. So we need to know where we are exactly referring. If somebody is experienced only in pediatric population, they may not be well equipped to see a patient who had a stroke and who is an adult. They may know the principles of all the treatment, but if they have not practiced, it is difficult. So I will give you an example now. Our HOD is a head and neck surgeon, or anybody who would have in the post of HOD, they generally don't check BP or draw the blood or any small procedures like what a nursing practitioner would do. It would generally go to a fellow or a junior doctor. But as soon as HOD or the professor needs to do, if he is not practiced for 6 months or 1 year, their hands are going to shiver. So this is even with having 20-25 years of experience. Now we are looking at having only experience in a field which is not even related to neurological conditions in adults. So that is the perspective or retrospection we are looking at, and seeing whether we can justify in the way we are looking at. We don't have anyone, that's why we'll refer it to whoever is available, is a safe way to say. But again, I'm not sure if it is justifiable from the fraternity per se. So we would like to not do anything than do any harm. So that is what my take on it, sir. So currently, like I said, I don't have a answer for that question.
Yeah, it's always tricky. I can understand that, how to establish competencies. I'm sure there are issues that you will be wrestling with.
That's right.
How to put it across. Do you think in circumstances such as these, where let's say it is established that a competence is not available, let's say locally, does tele-rehab, is it effective? Can it work? Can I, for example, put a video of my patient and connect with you, for example, and say, see, this is a situation? Does it help?
Yes, definitely, sir. Definitely. I would give you two perspectives. See, I'm really happy when you say that, okay, you are going to send, patients' videos and you are connecting with me, and I become important because, across the nation, everybody is wanting Prasanna's treatment. In a way, I'm happy that, I'm becoming famous, but more and more I do it, I become slave of it. And then only I am doing it is not good enough for the society. I need to make sure that, every individual who's trained in swallowing in educational setup, they should be as good as or better than me, so that, a greater population is reached. It may give me instant gratification, but I don't think I'm going to be happy about it. And I'm going to take, continuation of the last question as well. We would definitely put an effort to connect with you, the right people, whenever you connect with us. Let's say if a patient is there in Ranchi, and then you want somebody there who are willing to work with the patient. Probably I'll connect with them and ask them if they are comfortable. If they're not comfortable, let's say if they don't have that kind of training, we would make sure that we connect with them on a regular basis and make sure that whatever they are doing it in the right way. At least, let us know that, what problems or what challenges may be happening. If they are willing to cooperate or coordinate with us, I think as a person who's sitting in Bangalore, I will be more than willing to collaborate with them and help them give better service.
But the point I was trying to make, will tele-rehab be effective in case, it could be you, it could be anyone, competent, but can tele-rehab, are you finding that tele-rehab is effective in these,
That's
are you
right.
basically finding these situations?
Yeah, I think I missed the second part of the answer to the question. Now, the second part would be, now considering the scenario right now, COVID, which made us realize that we need to have tele-rehabilitation, and it also made us realize that we did not use tele-rehabilitation, and we just keep complaining that no, we don't have enough speech pathologists, spread across India. We're not able to cater to everyone. Probably we didn't explore those options earlier. Now, I'll give you one example where Telemedicine Society of India was existed from 2000. It is almost 20 years. They recently celebrated a 20 years anniversary. And then more and more studies and more practice has been happening in telerehabilitation. We are becoming better at teleservice. I think that is a good try. If there are no service available in suburban areas or tier 2, tier 3 cities, or even tier 1 cities in cases of lockdown, where they're not able to go to the hospital, logistic problem, family is not around, the patient is at home, they are hospitalized or bedridden. All those things can be taken care by telerehabilitation to some extent. Of course, we have to keep coming back and seeing whether we are doing any harm, if not any help. So I think we are evolving in that. We can effectively treat in some scenarios, but a speech pathologist who is doing telerehabilitation should have a protocol in place to say that, okay, this is the point where I can do justice to the patient. And at this point, probably I need to call the patient to the hospital because I think the patient is becoming worse, or probably the patient is having aspiration issues or safety of swallow issues. And then those protocols needs to be put in place, informed to the patient, and it should be respected both the sides, from the patient as well as from the clinicians. We can still do it.
Correct. I think, yes, as you rightly said, sir, as long as the protocols are clear, it does, I think that's the way forward, easily. But yes, the baselines, the protocols need to be put into place. And are you also seeing this as an aside, not directly connected to dysphagia, are you seeing these kind of situations happening in speech issues, for example, communication issues? Or are you seeing, for example, group sessions on communication issues happening, where a group of similar patients get together along with an SLP to facilitate communication? Are you seeing those kind of developments happening?
Yes, definitely. So people are starting to become more innovative in kind of, it could be the competition, could be because of the desperation of finance strains, or the profession would have that. If we don't innovate ourselves, probably we'll perish. I see creative things which are happening. Group sessions are being conducted, tele sessions for communication, aphasia therapy, neurorehabilitation. All of them has been used regularly. I see a lot of positive feedback from the patients as well, because they're going to get treatment at the doorstep. So they not even have to walk 100 meters from their home. So I think it is a great opportunity for both clinician as well as for the patients to improve upon or incorporate in the practice.
Fine, yeah, great. I'm seeing we are past 1 o'clock. Anyone else would like to come in with their thoughts or queries? Please feel free. I'm seeing Shruti Aishwarya, but we've been seeing other people. I think Bharatji was here for some time. Any queries, anyone? Otherwise, of course, Prasanna ji is also on the group. We will occasionally bother him. And I think Shruti ji has raised her hand again. Shruti ji, yes, please unmute yourself and you can speak up.
Okay. Sir, since my husband is aphasia, I have a little more interest in this topic, but this question is not for him. What I want to know is, I asked you the first question sometime back. There is a person with aphasia also with swallowing difficulties. So is it the prerequisite that the person swallowing difficulties become clear? He is able to take in some food and he has some, we will concentrate on treatment of aphasia.
I think voice was breaking. Is it only for me or it was?
Yeah, your voice broke, Shruti ji. If you can repeat the query, or maybe you can put in the chat.
I understood the question.
Okay. Yes. Then please carry on.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Shruti ji. I think your question was if both problems are there about swallowing as well as in aphasia or language problems, and whether to first clear out all the swallowing problems and then go to aphasia treatment. So, in my opinion, no, you can do it parallelly. It is going to be complementing each other because success in swallowing can even translate into success in language training as well. Both ways. It only breaks hurdles going forward. There is no evidence or no problems in carrying out parallel sessions if logistically it permits. But again, one caution from this side, if because of the swallowing problems, if there are other complications where hospitalizations are necessary, I think that is the priority, to have all the medical things cleared and then come to swallowing problems itself and then to aphasia, in that order. So you have to prioritize what is the bigger challenge or what is the greater risk for the patient's life as well as health condition. But otherwise, both can be worked together.
Thank you, sir.
The two therapies can proceed simultaneously, is what I understand. If it's okay, fine. Well, sir, I think we are almost 1:15. Thank you very much. We can close the session unless you have maybe some other pointers for us to carry, Prasanna ji, to close this.
So I think I can only have a request from the group, the Stroke Support India group, or any layman who may watch this video. It is important that you come forward with your needs. Then only the system will respond to you. If you leave every decision to be made at the healthcare level, probably some things may be missed. Unless you complain about certain things, it will not be taken up. I give a simple example. People would generally come to my OPD and say that this and this doctor asked us to go to you, and they would generally don't say anything more than that. I keep saying, tell me your problem. I would be able to help if possible, or at least guide you to the right person, based on my knowledge. I think more and more, initiation should come from public as well to get the right services. It should be effort from both sides. Public, when they ask, definitely it is going to be delivered in the right manner. And also you need to be vigilant about whom you are consulting for certain problems and what kind of thing reading in Google. Of course, Google is a great resource for information. It is also a great resource for misinformation. So you need to be cautious about that. Even social media, for that sake, I would generally ask somebody who doesn't have a Facebook account to get a Facebook account, because there are a lot of information which is available free of cost, which makes a lot of sense for us. But again, for those who are there in Facebook, you have to make sure that you see what exactly is true or validated by others. So I think that is more important for our service to go forward and better quality of life for both professions as well as for the public.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. As we were talking in the beginning of our conversation, there's an information explosion. How much of that is relevant? How much of that is authentic? How much of that applies to a specific case is always, it's a very difficult call. And certainly, the more we as patients, we as caregivers speak about the issues that we are facing, I can imagine the forums, the platforms are there for the medical community also to take note of that and to respond, which is ultimately the objective, of the community. That is obviously there. And as you said, going forward, you are making efforts. There are other bodies also making efforts. So the voice of the patient, voice of the caregiver is important. Obviously, it is the end point, so as to say, of the delivery. So thank you very much, Prasanna ji. It was a great session that we had. Thank you very much for all your efforts.
Actually, I'm the student here.
No,
I'm the student here. So
we all are learning, I think. It's very kind of you to say so, but we have learned a lot. I'm sure going forward, many of us will be continuing this process of interacting with you, and we'll take it further. So thank you very much for all your efforts. Thank you very much for everyone to join in. And I'm closing the meeting now. Thank you. Thank you again. All the best, everyone. Take care, sir.